First of all, thank you so much, Courtney. You did a lot of homework there. One of the things I learned in South Africa is when you have so many distinguished people in an audience, you can be forgiven for not mentioning everybody. You can say all protocols observed. So all protocols observed for those of you whom I don't single out today. I want to begin by saying, Courtney mentioned that in a few minutes I'll be getting an honorary degree. And I want to say what an honor it is for such a prestigious institution in the first instance, but even more so because it means President Ronald Crutcher didn't decide he made a mistake when he gave me one a few years ago at another institution. But I think it also affirms what President Crutcher and I have in common, and it's more than a February birthday, although that's kind of special to both of us. But I would like to think that it's because we share so many things in common, like the values that went into creating what I call our suits of armor, which I'll elaborate on in a moment, but not before I have thanked all the others who've agreed to bestow this single honor on me. Thank you. Now, let me hasten to salute those whose achievements brought us here today. The class of 2016. Will you join me in applauding yourselves? Not everybody's clapping. 2016, applaud yourselves. I also got permission from the Georgia Bulldogs to say, "Go Spiders!" That must be a bulldog up there. In my experience, dating back some 50-odd years, there's no day that compares to this one. Now, as you look at my gray hair and perhaps other things that point to how much older I am than most of you, you may wonder how I could possibly recall my graduation day and compare it to yours. Well, don't be fooled by appearances, for I subscribe to that thing that Jerome Tubin said about his mother, Marlene Sanders, who was a pioneering broadcast journalist before I was, and who kept on working after retiring from television, sharing her wisdom with students like you. And Tubin said of her mom that engagement in the world inhibits aging. Therefore, let me share with you, class of 2016, a few things we have in common as a result of my engagement in your world. That is, before I get to the most important. So don't sleep. My Twitter game is on fleek. I also use WhatsApp. But the TV sitcom Blackish informed me the other night that What's Up is old school and desperate. So I'm going to stop using that. I don't want to be accused of being old school. And my son Chuma, who has gone from being a broke artist lover on the old sitcom Girlfriends to the new NBC hit game show Game of Silence. Yes, I'm a proud mom, like all the proud moms in the room, and also my son said, if you do mention me, I'll tweet what you say today at graduation. Anyway, he gave me a pink selfie stick for my birthday, and that keeps my Instagram popping. But, hang on, I don't use Snapchat. It's causing too many car accidents, so follow me on that. Don't Snapchat in the cars. I also read with interest and sometimes understanding new words that have entered your lexicon, class of 2016, like meme and emoji. And I hear that awesome has been superseded in your vocabulary by dope, which Jamal Lyons and others on Empire the other night were using the whole hour. But in my day, dope meant something else, so I'm going to stick with awesome, okay? So, what an awesome day it is for the class of 2016. Now, as hard as it might be for you to imagine my graduation day over half a century ago, I can assure you that congratulations had the same meaning then as it has now. I've done a little homework, and I've learned that what these years at Richmond have provided you. And with the same thing that University of Georgia provided me, albeit reluctantly. And no matter how much time has elapsed, it really is the same thing, and that is a great liberal education. But equally important, you were outfitted with another layer of something that is invisible but powerfully protective, and it's something I call armor. Armor added to armor like mine that enabled me to successfully confront the challenges I faced back in those days. For challenges like pollen live in our lives forever. Although for the environmental pollen, there are effective remedies like local honey. I know I'm on it now. But there are also other prescriptions that can heal some of the societal ills that confront every generation, including yours, but which at the moment seems to have reached new levels, at least in our time. Now, if you'll indulge me for a moment in what I think I'm going to do is help you understand my perspective as I speak to you today. I grew up in the South, as Courtney said, under a system full of challenges because it didn't recognize me or anyone who looked like me as a citizen deserving of all the promises offered to citizens. And yet my family, my neighbors, and my teachers at school and at church comprised the village. You know, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, I was in that kind of village. Like all of those who looked like me, they were throughout the South, and they had survived the slings and arrows of their outrageous fortune because they too wore armor. Their armor was called faith. And it was made up, in the case of my family, 2 preachers and 2 grandmothers who were living saints. But it was also faith captured in the poet James Weldon Johnson's poem that went, "Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us." That dark past he was referring to, dating back to the 1600s, that saw legions of people who looked like me and my family survive, and in many cases prosper, despite some of the most horrendous treatment ever put on human beings, most horrendous treatment human beings were ever exposed to. That faith was alive in our segregated village that couldn't give us first-class citizenship, but they gave little colored children like me a first-class sense of ourselves. And with it, the responsibility of being good citizens, good neighbors, even before we were legally citizens. But being good citizens against all odds led to my generation changing the face of the South and establishing a legacy that inspired others fighting for freedom, justice, and equality from South Africa a few years back to Tunisia most recently, although if you read the newspapers, their challenges, like ours, continue. But as young people like yourselves, class of 2016, and some older ones too, were working to achieve our victory, I and one other black student in my graduating class of 1600 sat listening to a speaker. He was a Georgia senator who that day spoke about the majesty of local law, which affirmed segregation and inequality. But our presence there was a testament to the majesty of a higher law, affirmed by the Supreme Court in its 1954 decision outlawing the lie of separate but equal. Now, there were still those who believed as the segregationist senator did, including rioting students and their adult supporters, who upon my entry uttered ugly racial epithets, and later one threw a rock through my first floor dormitory window. Later that night, as I was taken out by one of the school officials, allegedly for my own safety, and into a night filled with tear gas that was applied suspiciously late by the police, and not knowing who among those who hated me were still out there, deep in my consciousness was the armor of a Bible verse one of my sainted grandmothers, had insisted that I learn at an early age. And it went, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." I'm talking about armor. Now to our similarities class. As I said earlier, I know a little bit about your history, although I've learned more this morning. The twins were amazing, weren't they? I am knocked out by them, but by so many of the rest of you that I've met. I wanted to know, by the way, what my good brother, Ron Crutcher, was getting himself into when he accepted the position of president. And I know from reading and from personal testimonies of people long associated with Richmond, and more recently from a friend who is the father of one of your fellow graduates, that you have been equipped with the tools that have given you or reinforced a first-class sense of yourselves. We just heard that from the twins. And that is your armor, crafted for you out of the faith that your parents had in you in the first instance, and all others along the way who were charged with polishing or adding another layer to that armor. Wearing your armor gave you the courage to try new things, an armor like the one of those I wrapped my son in when he was about 6, and we had fallen behind in a doubles tennis match. And he was walking around with the racket hanging down and his shoulders bent like this, and I leaned over to him and I said, "Son, don't get down even when we're all the way down." And not long ago, close to over 40 years later, he tweeted it, encouraging fellow actors and other friends who have challenging careers, and maybe from time to time, still even himself. And from what I've learned about you, members of the class of 2016, is that your ability to meet difficult challenges and be open to new things have equipped you to enjoy a level of intimacy with other people and their cultures and philosophical and aesthetic cosmopolitanism that previous generations could never have imagined. Already, so many of you have been involved in projects that have made valuable or even invaluable contributions to the common good, both here and around the world. For example, healthcare delivery, I found out. Healthcare delivery to the poor in a way no other generation could have imagined, by drones. I mean, this is something new, isn't it not? Or your understanding of why it's important to invest in urban education, because many, if not most of those in urban schools are students of color who will need to be prepared like you are today to make their contributions to a society when in the next 40 years or so, they become the majority in this country. I'm also impressed with some of your involvement in newly emerging issues beyond these borders, like helping asylum seekers in places like Lithuania, all of which, by either participation or example, has given you the humanitarian consciousness you will need to carry on being good citizens in these interesting times. Now, I hasten to say that I used to think that the Chinese saying, "May you live in interesting times," was a blessing, until a Chinese friend of mine told me that I was wrong, that it was not a blessing, but a curse, about which more later. But on to our similarities, which, as you class might say, our similarities are tight. So, you too are pioneers, dare I say, awesome pioneers, embarking on a journey that will require you to use all of the tools you've developed here to keep on keeping on. Now, that's a saying from back in the day, but you have my permission to use it, just like I use, on fleek, because it's still relevant to your generation. But I also learned another biblical lesson shared by a man of the cloth, and it applies to you as well as to myself. And it goes like this: the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. And so when you flip your tassels from one side of your cap to the other, you and all of your classmates will have the official creds to make use of your delightful inheritance, helping to continue to be contributors to making your home, your community, and the world a better place. But that, as you may already know, but which I will reemphasize, requires getting some things into proper proportion. So let me briefly tell you a story that I think illustrates the point. A few years back, I visited a refugee camp in southern Sudan, where dozens of men, women, and children had fled marauding bands of killers. There, as I stood by taking notes, the women refugees described to Nelson Mandela's wife, Graça Machel, their danger-filled journey into the forest to forage for food that was scarce in the camp. When Mrs. Machel asked why didn't the men go into the forest to forage for food, one of the women said quietly, "Why, they would be killed. We would only be raped." I processed what I was hearing in 3 ways. With the critical thinking skills that, like you, I developed in college, the journalism I had studied and practiced over the years, the moral core of my village, the village family that had instilled it in me, and also emotions that spoke to me that day, emotions as the woman I was and as a human being. And my editors at NPR, always alert to things that might violate journalistic ethics, applauded my story, calling it strong, and gave me all the space I needed. Now, my point here is this. Intellect is defined as the faculty of reasoning and understanding objectively, and journalists are supposed to be objective. But I've always rejected that term in favor of fairness and balance, since I'm a creature of my environment and background and not a machine like my computer, although it occasionally tries to think for me. But my computer has no emotion or background that shaped its perceptions, at least not yet, and I do. But I also believe emotion should be used with great care so that it doesn't overwhelm intellect and critical thinking. Since we are all fallible human beings, good citizenship may even require us to occasionally struggle to achieve a proper balance. But our critical thinking will always come to our rescue. I also further believe that we live richer lives when we use all of the above to make informed judgments about issues and people in what Martin Luther King called the beloved community here at home and the global community abroad. For Dr. King's focus was never just on this country alone, but even going back generations, he focused on the larger world. And that led to him saying, "We are all wrapped in a single garment of destiny." And assuming you have critical thinking, intellect, and emotion in proper proportion, I hope you would employ those and seek out good information, as well as news that you can use. Not quotable quips that make for clever headlines or noisy discussions with everybody talking over everybody else, but information that will help you make good judgments about ourselves and all of our neighbors near and far. It's out there, if you but look for it and not be wedded to only one source, or for that matter, only one medium. I think the latter is helping to feed the toxic political environment we are currently experiencing that is breeding or exposing deep divisions that are being exploited today in the U.S. political arena, and that are making a nation that has been a leader of the free world look like a poorly written soap opera. I hope you are as frustrated as I am, class, about the often breathless, cacophonous, and uncivil noise that passes for, dare I say, journalism that is helping foment the toxicity and causing some to react out of emotion, devoid of intellect and critical thinking. The playwright Wajahat Ali recently wrote in a New York Times op-ed piece about a toxic mix of fear, ignorance, and hate that clouds the better judgment of otherwise well-intentioned Americans. He was speaking of those who, he wrote, transform common occurrences and dark-skinned neighbors into permanent threats. But while his comments referred specifically to Muslims, that same toxic wind doesn't stop blowing there. And while some commentators seem to think that this is the worst they've ever seen, maybe in my and your lifetime, our founders were prescient. For they wrote not of a perfect union, but of a more perfect union. And as troubling and as ugly as this political campaign is, one way to look at it is that it is a part of a journey towards a more perfect union. It's not the first time for ugliness in a presidential campaign. It's just what's happening in your time. Again, part of the journey towards a more perfect union. But also, like the allergies that had me bedridden a few weeks ago, there are medications that can moderate, if not eliminate, the toxicity, about which more in a minute. For soon, you will take up residence in a society as one of a unique group of people whose educational credentials and experience hold out the promise of helping to create a more perfect union through informed and committed citizenship, if not leadership, in good times and in interesting times. And if you need a little reinforcement from time to time, as we all do, here's a prescription from a 9-year-old girl in Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania, who recently took it upon herself to cover news in her community. She was 9, and she was called out by some adults for not knowing her place as a child going to tea parties. Here's what she told those adults. She said, "I know some of you just want me to sit down and be quiet because I'm 9. If you want me to stop covering the news, then you get off your computers and do something about the news." Did I say I would recommend some medicine for today's ills? And so, to that 9-year-old's advice, I would add, get out to vote. And get out to vote in an election in which some of the very tenets of American democracy are at stake. To those of you who vote in this country, your intellect and your capacity to analyze, not to mention your energy, are sorely needed. And to those of you who don't vote in this country, your informed communication with those who do is important. For President Barack Obama told students at Howard University's graduation yesterday that only 20% of young people voted in the last election. This election is about what happens, not to my future, but what happens to your future. So it is very important, as I'm sure you know, that you pay close attention. Finally, one more example that I hope and believe will confirm that there are prescriptions that will help us all stride toward freedom at home and abroad. I'm doing a year-long series for the PBS NewsHour called Race Matters, looking at solutions to issues involving the country's oldest and, dare I say, unresolved ill, which is racism. But I think it has other applications that speak to one of the things that President Crutcher and this university are committed to, and that is diversity. And what years of research taught me before I embarked on this journey is that there are indeed solutions, including how to get past the challenge of what Northeastern professor Linda Trop calls racial anxiety, which I think applies to any stereotypical thinking of any group. She says what often happens is when we feel anxious, we kind of shut down. We're a little more likely to depend on stereotypes for how we perceive people and how we respond to people. So we need to give people opportunities for real engagement, the kind that you've had at this university across group lines, and those needed to be repeated actions. And another person I interviewed said, yeah, but the choir's got to practice every Wednesday night, you know? That's what you've got to do. You've got to keep going at it. And so it is my hope that every now and then, young and slightly older people will allow someone like me to join you in a coalition of the generations to keep going at it, reimagining a society where every human being is judged, in Dr. King's words, not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And also discussing our history, which is crucial to understanding our present and our future. It is history that teaches us that being a good citizen is hard work. And while you can leave your classrooms here, If you want to be as good a citizen as you were a student, you can never stop studying. You can never stop learning and applying critical thinking taught here to the world beyond these walls. And while activism may or may not be your shtick, there are all kinds of ways of being a good citizen. In my day, those who marched and demonstrated and worked toward a better society were what Dr. King called the movement of the maladjusted. And as I said earlier, look at how that movement changed the world. I prefer to think that we are simply in a historical moment, not new normal. As the New York Times wrote when President Obama welcomed the portrait of Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill, the Times wrote, President Obama may well have captured a historical moment for a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multiracial nation moving contentiously through the early years of a new century. I've been around long enough to know that the armor of faith that will help us all meet the challenges of contentious, interesting times, whether they are personal or political or professional, whether you choose to actively embrace a cause or simply be well informed about the ones that impact your lives, and whether your armor of faith comes by the way of the church or the mosque or the synagogue or from a scientist like Edward Teller, who once said, when you come to the end of all light that you know, and it's time to step into the darkness of the unknown, faith is knowing that one of two things shall happen. Either you will be given something solid to stand on, or you will be taught how to fly. So I look forward to your pioneering journey to the horizons, hopefully continuing to follow what has been posited by an early theologian and repeated so forcefully by Dr. King, and that is that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And so, in closing, I challenge you today. I challenge you to take notes as you leave this place and shed your graduation garments, notes that will enable you one day to stand here and help polish the armor of those students who will sit as you are sitting today, endowed with the tools that you are to be exemplary human beings in every walk of life, and then rise with the confidence you now have to fly, as you soon will, into a world eagerly awaiting your goodness and your gifts. Once again, congratulations, class of 2016. You are indeed awesome.